You're driving a car that isn't registered in your name. Maybe your sister let you borrow it for the weekend. Maybe your coworker tossed you the keys. Maybe it's a rental and the paperwork is in someone else's name. Then the lights come on behind you. You pull over. The officer walks up, takes your license, glances around the cabin, and asks what sounds like the simplest question in the world. Is this your car? Most people answer instantly, and that is exactly where the stop can begin to change, because that question is almost never just conversation. It is a pressure point, a test, a way to see whether you will start volunteering details the officer did not need to hear, could not force you to narrate, and may later use to stretch a basic traffic stop into something much bigger. By the end of this video, you'll know why that question matters so much, what the courts have actually said about borrowed and rental cars, and the one calm response that can keep you from talking your way into trouble. And stick with me, because even if you handle that first question perfectly, there are follow-ups officers use to reopen the same trap from different angles. First, let's clear something up. When an officer asks who the car belongs to, he usually already has a very good idea. If he ran the plate before he got to your window, he likely saw the vehicle registration return. That means the registered owner's information is already on his screen. In many stops, he is not asking because he lacks data. He's asking because he wants your version of the story. And that difference changes everything. The roadside is full of questions that feel casual but are actually diagnostic. Where are you headed? Where are you coming from? Is there anything illegal in the vehicle? Whose car is this? Each one sounds ordinary. Each one invites you to relax. But each one also creates an opportunity to compare your words with documents, timelines, body language, and whatever assumptions the officer is already forming. That is why people get caught by this question so often. They think they are being polite. The officer hears something else entirely. If you answer, "No, it's my friend's car," that sounds harmless to you. To the officer, it may trigger a whole different set of possibilities. Who's the friend? How did you get the car? Did they give you permission? Can that be verified? Are you supposed to have it right now? Did you just accidentally confirm you're driving a vehicle that doesn't belong to you without giving any details that prove lawful possession? You didn't confess to a crime, but you may have just handed over a thread an investigator can start pulling. Then comes the answer that gets even more people in trouble, the full explanation. "No, it's my cousin's. He loaned it to me because my car's in the shop and I had to pick up some boxes from my aunt's place and then I'm taking it back tonight." That answer feels cooperative. It feels honest. It feels like the kind of thing a normal person says when trying not to make the stop awkward. But now look at what happened. You didn't just identify the car. You created a mini story. That story has names, purpose, timing, travel plans, and details that can be measured against everything else you say next. If one part shifts later, even innocently, the stop can start to feel different from the officer's side of the window. And once an officer thinks the story is wobbling, the mission of the stop can begin to expand. Then there's the third common mistake, and this one often comes from people who know just enough about their rights to make the situation worse. "Why are you asking me that? Am I being detained? What does that have to do with anything?" Now, to be clear, you absolutely have constitutional rights. You do not have to chat your way through an investigation, but tone matters on the roadside. If your first instinct is to fire back with sarcasm, anger, or edge, the officer may interpret that as agitation, evasiveness, or consciousness of guilt. Fair or not, that is often how it gets written down later. So now you can see the three classic mistakes. The first person answers briefly and gives the officer a reason to keep digging. The second person over-explains and supplies extra facts for free. The third person pushes back in a way that raises the emotional temperature. Three different instincts. Same result. The stop gets longer, more personal, and more dangerous. Now let's step back and talk about why length matters so much. A traffic stop is not supposed to be an open-ended fishing expedition. The Supreme Court addressed this in Rodriguez v. United States in 2015. The basic principle is simple. A traffic stop has a lawful purpose, and the officer is supposed to handle the ordinary tasks tied to that purpose with reasonable diligence. That includes things like checking your license, registration, proof of insurance, and whether there are warrants. But once the work tied to the stop is finished, the officer cannot prolong the detention just to go hunting for unrelated criminal evidence unless there is independent legal justification. That rule matters because it gives you a kind of clock, not a stopwatch in your hand, but a legal boundary. The officer gets time to deal with the stop itself. What he does not get is unlimited time to turn a broken taillight or minor lane violation into a free-form criminal investigation. So how does the question about the car fit into that? Simple. It helps generate suspicion. If your answer is confusing, shaky, overly detailed, or defensive, the officer may claim those observations contributed to reasonable suspicion. Once that phrase enters the picture, everything changes. The stop can stretch. A K9 may be called. More questions may follow, consent may be requested, and suddenly the issue is no longer the original reason you were pulled over. It is whatever narrative grew out of the roadside conversation you thought you were managing. That's why the safest answer is not the one that sounds nicest. It's the one that reveals as little as possible while still complying with what the law actually requires. And to understand why that matters so much in a borrowed or rented car, you need to know about a case most drivers have never heard of. In 2018, the Supreme Court decided Byrd v. United States. The case involved a driver in a rental car who was not listed on the rental agreement. Police searched the car, and part of the government's position rested on the idea that because Byrd wasn't on the paperwork, he had no reasonable expectation of privacy in the vehicle. That argument sounds powerful. A lot of people instinctively believe it. Not my name, not my car, not my rights. But the Supreme Court rejected that broad assumption. The court held that a person in lawful possession and control of a rental car can have a reasonable expectation of privacy, even if his name is not listed on the rental agreement. In plain English, your rights do not disappear just because the registration or contract has someone else's name on it. Lawful possession matters. Control matters. The real-world relationship to the vehicle matters. That's a huge point, because roadside pressure often pushes drivers toward the opposite belief. Officers may ask questions in a way that makes you feel like you need to prove you belong there. Like the moment the car isn't yours, you lose your footing. That is not automatically true. But there's another case that makes the picture more complicated. In Rackus v. Illinois, decided in 1978, the Supreme Court made clear that passengers generally do not have the same standing to challenge a search of a vehicle when they lack a personal privacy interest in the areas searched. So the law draws distinctions. The driver in lawful possession may have a stronger basis to assert privacy rights than a passenger with no ownership or control over the vehicle. That difference is important because your own words can accidentally blur where you stand. If you start talking loosely, minimizing your relationship to the vehicle, or sounding like you have no authority over it at all, you may not be helping yourself. You may be undermining the very legal position you would want to preserve later. And there's one more legal point most people don't realize. If the officer tells you to step out of the car, you generally have to comply. The Supreme Court addressed that in Pennsylvania v. MIMS, which allows officers in ordinary traffic stops to order drivers out of the vehicle for officer safety reasons. So this is not about refusing every instruction. It is not about turning a stop into a showdown. It is about separating physical compliance from verbal surrender. Those are two different things. You can step out of the vehicle and still decline to answer investigative questions. You can hand over documents and still refuse consent to search. You can remain calm and still protect yourself. That distinction is where most people lose control of the encounter. They think if they comply with one thing, they must comply with everything. That is not how rights work. So what should you actually say when the officer asks, "Is this your car?" Here is the response. "Officer, the registration speaks for itself. I'm not answering questions." That line works because it does three things at once. First, it redirects the officer to the document he is legally entitled to review anyway. The registration is the paper record of ownership. If the question is truly about who the vehicle is registered to, the answer is already in his hand or right in front of him. You are not withholding the legally relevant document. You are refusing to become the narrative. Second, it avoids the trap of storytelling. You're not naming relatives, friends, employers, landlords, or travel plans. You're not building a timeline. You're not offering explanations that can be misheard, misquoted, or picked apart later. You're not giving the officer extra facts that expand the stop. Third, it does all of this without hostility. That matters. Calm language sounds different from confrontation. The goal is not to win the roadside exchange. The goal is to get through it without supplying ammunition. Now, could you say it slightly differently? Sure. Everything you need is on the registration. I'm choosing not to answer questions. The registration identifies the vehicle, officer. I'm not answering any questions. I provided my documents. I won't be answering questions. The exact wording is less important than the structure. Direct him to the paperwork. Decline the interview. Stay calm. And yes, there is an important practical note here. When you're driving, you still generally have to provide the required documents. License, registration, insurance. Some states also have statutes involving identification in certain stop contexts. This is not advice to refuse lawful document requests. It is advice to stop narrating your life, because an officer asked a question with a friendly tone. Those are not the same thing. Now let's talk about what happens next, because the first answer is only the opening round. If you hold your line, officers often shift tactics. The first tactic is guilt. If you've got nothing to hide, why not just tell me? This works on millions of people because it reframes silence as suspicious. But legally, silence is not a confession. Exercising a right is not evidence that a crime occurred. The pressure here is psychological, not logical. So the response stays the same. Officer, the registration is there. I'm not answering questions. No speeches, no debate about the Constitution, no roadside seminar. The moment you start explaining why you're not talking, you are already talking. The second tactic is escalation. So whose car is it really? You're making this harder than it needs to be. Step out of the vehicle. If you are ordered out, get out calmly. No sudden movements, no dramatic gestures. Keep your hands visible. Follow physical commands that are lawful. But understand this clearly, stepping out of the car does not erase your Fifth Amendment instincts. You can comply with the movement while refusing the conversation. That distinction may be the single most useful skill a driver can learn. The third tactic is inconvenience. If this isn't your car, maybe I need the owner to come down here. Maybe we need to sort this out before anybody leaves. Maybe I should verify your story. This is where nervous people start filling silence with explanations. They call someone. They overshare. They start improvising details to sound helpful, and that is exactly the moment the stop gets harder to control. You do not fix pressure by producing more words. Usually you make it worse. Then comes the request the earlier question was often building toward all along. You mind if I take a look inside? That answer should be simple and unmistakable. I do not consent to any searches. Not, I'd rather you didn't. Not, is that necessary? Not, there's nothing in there, but just, I do not consent to any searches. And if the officer searches anyway, your refusal still matters. You do not physically resist. You do not argue on the shoulder. You make the record clear. Then you let your lawyer deal with the legality later, because that is another huge mistake people make. They think rights only count if the officer respects them in the moment. That's not true. Sometimes the whole battle is about preserving the issue for later review, not winning the confrontation on the roadside. Then there's the dog threat. Maybe I'll call K9. We can wait for a dog. If you're not hiding anything, it won't be a problem. This is where Rodriguez matters again. If the mission of the traffic stop is complete, police generally cannot extend the stop for a dog sniff without additional legal justification. So if the detention appears to be dragging into fishing expedition territory, the most useful question is not a speech. It's this: am I free to leave? That question forces a fork in the road. If the answer is yes, the stop should end. If the answer is no, then the officer is owning the detention, which matters later. Either way, you have moved the stop back toward the legal issue instead of the emotional one. And that brings us to the bigger lesson underneath all of this. A traffic stop feels social. It feels personal. It feels like an ordinary conversation with a little authority mixed in. That is why so many people misplay it. They respond the way they would respond to a coworker, a neighbor, or a security guard asking a casual question. But a traffic stop is not casual. It is a state encounter with legal consequences. The officer may be polite. He may sound relaxed. He may smile. None of that changes the structure of the event. He is gathering information. You are the source. And once you understand that, the strategy becomes much clearer. You do not need to be rude. You do not need to be theatrical. You do not need to recite law school notes through a cracked window. You need to be disciplined. Hand over the documents you are required to provide. Do not volunteer the story. Do not consent to searches. If the stop appears complete, ask whether you are free to go. And above all, do not let a borrowed car make you believe you borrowed away your rights. Because that is the real power of this question. Is this your car? It sounds like ownership. But underneath it, the officer may be probing for authority, inconsistency, nervousness, consent, and leverage. He may be trying to find out whether you will make his job easier by doing it for him. Most people do. They explain, they reassure, they improvise, they talk because silence feels uncomfortable. But the law does not require you to make the roadside more comfortable. It requires certain documents, it allows certain police instructions, it creates certain limits. And within those limits, your best protection is often the simplest one. Say less, so memorize the line. Officer, the registration speaks for itself. I'm not answering questions. And if the search request comes, memorize the next one too. I do not consent to any searches. Those two sentences won't guarantee a perfect stop. Nothing can do that. But they dramatically reduce the odds that you will transform a routine encounter into a bigger legal problem with your own mouth. Because in moments like this, the most dangerous thing in the car is often not what's in the trunk. It's the urge to explain. If you want more videos that break down the hidden pressure points in police encounters, searches, and roadside questioning in plain English, subscribe now. And if there's a legal situation you want unpacked next, drop it in the comments.